Strangers from the internet are standing outside. The strangers from the internet have come from far and wide. But I cannot receive them. I hardly believe in them.
Hello, and welcome back to Shadow Yaddo. I'm Elena Richardson. The days are getting longer, and it's time for some big sky. So today we head out west, carving up back roads in step with Greensky Bluegrass, Cooder, and some incredibly talented Yaddo artists. My very first idea of America as a kid growing up in Britain came from westerns. Rugged landscape, rugged folks, and a romantic, largely misplaced, notion of freedom built on self-reliance. Our guests today have each, in their own work, chipped away at that false portrait, and yet they've done it with respect for the people who inhabit that mythologized territory and history. I'll be speaking with photographer Peter Kayafas about his recent exhibition and book, The Way West, a project that explores the dramatic and wide-open landscape of the Plains States, as well as the heritage and traditions of people living in a region where, despite the tropes of cowboys, dust, and tumbleweed, challenges are inherently layered and complex. But first, we'll hear from Maxim Loskutoff. He's one of those writers whose work seems, after the fact, well, eerily prescient. Consider an armed occupation and escalation into civil war. Ring any bells? That's something he wrote about in his 2018 debut story collection, Come West and See. And, spoiler alert, consider the weird respiratory infection that shows up in his latest novel, Ruthie Fear, a book he was working on at Yaddo in 2019. Back then, he described the book as a meditation on the cultural breaking apart of the American West. We spoke with him about guns, rural versus urban, Ruthie Fear, and more. Here's Max.
Should've been a farmer and blamed it on the weather, with a tied back and soiled hands to show for my efforts. Burned and dry from all of these questions. What's it worth? Does it last? Is this wrong? Can guns make less mistakes without love?
I really had no idea this was going to be a novel, nor did I have any idea that this character was going to be one that was going to live in my head and walk beside me for almost 6 years. It began in the wake of a mass shooting in a creative writing classroom in Oregon, and to attempt to write about a little tiny town in which everyone is armed to the teeth, and then in the last act they sort of accidentally all shoot each other. And then this character started sort of speaking to the idea, and she just kept surprising me. I mean, the first way she surprised me is that it was a woman, and then over and over her reactions, the way she perceived this intellectual idea I had, completely reshaped it. But Ruthie just kept coming back. One of the interesting or ironic things about me growing up in Montana is that Montana was the last thing I wanted to read about. I felt that culture existed somewhere outside, and that if I wanted to be a writer, I had to go to that place. And so it wasn't until I accepted Montana back into my heart. I was actually living in New York City, and I was in the midst of the culture that I had dreamt of. And I was going to readings constantly and seeing music and going to bars, meeting the kinds of people I had always dreamt of. But I was also finding that in ways there was an echo chamber. And I kept remembering and seeing things about Montana that I had never noticed when I had lived there, and yet which seemed incredibly foundational to what it is to be an American today, to what it is to be a human today, that were somewhat overlooked in the work that was being written around me. That felt like sort of the little ray of light or the little crack of space in which I started to find what I could add to the conversation of literature. For me, when I would walk in the woods as a kid and still today, there's the awe of the wild, there's the fear, there's all of it. There's also a sense that around every corner, literally anything could appear. You know, not only a grizzly bear, but if a grizzly bear is possible, then anything at the edges of my imagination must also be possible. One thing I've always reacted against is the romanticization of the West. And for me, the West is anything but pastoral. And so in my work, I'm always very conscious of the attempt to honor the beauty of this landscape, which overwhelms me every day when I step out in the midst of it. At the same time, to not romanticize it or to not to sort of attempt to tame it through the words on the page, to allow it to be as dark and cruel and unpredictable and wild as it truly is. And I don't feel like this landscape can be written without discomfort. I generally am drawn to the people who make me the most angry. And it's the same whenever I feel antipathy or that kind of resistance or darkness inside myself towards someone, that feels like someone I need to write about. And so when you take a character, for example, in Ruthie Fear, her father, whose name is Rutherford, he names her after himself. He's that kind of guy. I began the book intending for him to be the villain. He represented a certain kind of man that I grew up around that was everything that I didn't want to be. The kind of guy who lived in these trailers at the edges of the valley where I grew up and hunted out of season, wolfskin rug on his floor, and he runs a business cleaning skulls so they can be taxidermied. And so he began the book for me as the antagonist, but what I've seen time and again in writing is if I spend months or years within somebody's head, the person who I began by hating the most often ends up being the one who I love the most at the end. I'm interested in the people who are at the margins and who are just swept up in the events of the modern world, because that is our true place in relation to nature. It's always a limited perception if we come to believe we're in control of the situation when we're out in the wild. There is no place more American right now than the West, because this kind of rage, the feelings that represent Trumpism, are feelings that have been present here in the West for decades, and that have been bubbling up through the Freemen, through the Bundys, through all these different militia movements here in the West. Because I feel, in a sense, like reality keeps catching up with my fears, particularly since January 6th, when the Capitol was stormed. There's a way in which it almost feels liberating now. For me and for people all across the world watching that, I know a lot of the last vestiges of what this country is versus how we would want to perceive it fell away. And to me, that was a huge relief, because my experience of being an American has been to always feel like I lived in a country that could not see itself in the mirror. And I ended up working a bit with veterans in New York, and this was a kind of a common symptom of PTSD is to actually look in the mirror and not be able to see or recognize yourself. And that was how I always felt when people would talk about America. I don't mean that just in terms of the bad or the good. It was always, America was just somewhere in between these things to me. And in that moment, it felt like America really finally started to see its face in the mirror. To me, yeah, that's that's critical, no matter how we go forward, because those people and those feelings are a part of us, and they have been a part of us since the very beginning. So much of our history has been driven by that anger, resentment, and loneliness, and feeling of being left behind. Everyone I know, and people in the cities do it just the same way, is they define themselves by the people who they are not. So my friends in Portland, Oregon, very much define themselves as being everything that the Trump supporter in rural Idaho is not. And we've gotten really trapped in that being the most important part of a lot of people's identity, rather than even what they are. That's especially prevalent in the rural West, because so many of the things that they used to be don't exist anymore, or are now looked down on. Being a logger is rare. Most of the former loggers are not anymore, and now they work at a gas station. And that thing that they used to be, that they defined themselves, is gone. Same with miners, or a lot of these kinds of industries that were the backbone of rural America are gone. And so into that vacuum has come resentment and anger. The things that actually fill our souls are the things that we are proud to say, I am a writer, I am a person who works off the land, or who builds houses, or, everybody needs that sense of something to be proud of. Until we find new ways of finding purpose and of defining ourselves in terms of things that we are and things that we are proud of, that kind of division, all these chasms are going to get bigger and bigger, and they're going to get more and more insane. And that's where we're at now, is that we've pushed into the astral plane. We've pushed into the realm of QAnon and the absolute farthest reaches of our imagination in terms of defining what we are not. And so that's a very scary place we find ourselves as a country. We're drawn to the wild, and then we seek to tame a part of it, and in the attempt, we lose the thing that we love. This is kind of the foundational tragedy of settlers in the West, is there was always this position of opposition to nature. It's important for my work to capture the incredible beauty and grace and love that exists here in every breath in the West, along with the incredible suffering and that feeling of being a part of the landscape, and also a part of what is either destroying or attempting to destroy it. And that paradox is, I think, something that, in a very deep way, people in the West and people in this country in general need to reckon with as we move forward into, hopefully, a new way of being.
Make less mistakes without love. To feel anything, handgun. We borrowed in case this works. We can't pay for rent.
Peter Kayafas is a photographer, publisher, curator, and teacher. He's the director of the Aikens Press Foundation and serves as co-chair of Yaddo's board. Peter's photographs have been widely exhibited and are in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the New York Public Library, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Art Institute of Chicago, among others. Peter's also my neighbour in Harlem, and I'm delighted to have the chance to catch up with him and talk about his own creative work.
see what you see? Do you think you see me?
So, Peter, both as a beautiful book and as an exhibition, The Way West is indelibly in my mind as one of the artistic casualties of this pandemic. I remember being just so looking forward to the launch celebration. It was in March of last year. And then, as with so many projects, all of that had to come to an end. It was cancelled. But one reason this cancellation struck me as really particularly painful was because I understood how many years of work had gone into it. If we go back even further, I think I'm right in saying that these images, these 72 duotones, are the product of 10 years of regular trips to the Plain States, yes?
Yes, I think literally they're a decade in terms of the dates of the pictures, but certainly everything that came before them in terms of both my travel and my experience with making pictures is a part of those 72 pictures.
So what sparked your interest in the region initially? I know you had other projects you were working on, but why did it turn into such a decade of dedicated focus?
Well, I think one thing has always led to another in my work, beginning with wanting to be in New York City, coming out of high school and moving here to go to NYU, which was as good an excuse as any I could think of to be here and make photographs on the streets. But as I read more and paid more attention to the photographs that moved me and excited me, I got interested in being in the South. So I spent really the first decade or so of my photographs on the road, which is sort of my MO, which I'll get to in a minute, in the South, and gradually sort of made my way west and spent some time in San Francisco photographing up and down the coast of California. And I always drove across the country with some haste and never paid a whole lot of attention to the big open plains states, Nebraska and Wyoming and Montana and the Dakotas, and to a certain degree Oklahoma and even northern Colorado. So at some point I did slow down and stop and spend some time there. And like most of the projects that I have been involved with for long periods of time, the first round of results were exciting enough to me that I thought, okay, well, next time I have my month off next summer, I'm going to go to the West. And that just happened over and over again for more than 10 years, but the work in this book is really distilled from 10 years of month-long trips for each of those years.
Were these trips then a conscious antidote to New York life?
Well, I think they've become a conscious antidote to New York life. Probably it's not such a unique feeling to not feel like there needs to be an antidote to New York life when one first gets here. And that was certainly the case. It was just in the beginning the sheer excitement of seeing something different and of using the camera as a means to explore and to learn from my experience. But now, I'd say 30 years later, it really has become a necessary kind of psychic antidote to the kind of frenzy and, frankly, social intensity of my life in New York.
Going back to The Way West, the images, it seems to me, are all connected by existing in a liminal state. Whether teenagers or animals or abandoned places, they capture a moment trapped between two stages, perhaps two levels of consciousness. That's something that lies behind all of your work, am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of looking at it, and I'm grateful for your being perceptive about that. I think photography itself functions in a sort of liminal state because, of course, we don't see the world in fractions of a second, nor do we see the world in rectangles, nor do we see the world in black and white necessarily. So that's an element of the medium. But I'm also interested in images where there's a sense that there's a history embedded in the subject matter, and also a sense that maybe something has just happened or something is about to happen. I like that because I think it creates room for other people's narratives.
Are there ethical dilemmas, though, in the sense that you're seeing, possibly even imposing, a narrative without exploration or asking those involved?
I suppose ethical dilemmas exist everywhere. I think they would be more explicit and more problematic, or at least I would feel like they would be more problematic if I considered myself a documentary photographer in the sense that I was reporting on what was happening. One of the things that's become clearer to me, and I think is important for me to acknowledge in my own work, is that I'm not a impartial bystander. I'd like to think of myself as an open-minded bystander, but these pictures are really about my experience, and I'm as careful as I can to make sure that my experience is as unpreconceived and open-minded as possible, but it would be disingenuous to suggest that I'm somehow portraying just purely somebody else's experience, because it's really seen literally and metaphorically through the lens of my accumulated visual knowledge, cultural knowledge, anticipations, surely prejudices and preoccupations and things that I've read and seen and talked to people about. But, I really try to make myself as open and sensitive to the situation that I'm in as I can. And also without being preoccupied by the results. One of the things that I never used to have to say to anybody because it didn't really matter, it was sort of the universal modus operandi for photographers, but is now increasingly rare, is that I use film. So if I'm on the road for a month and shoot 100 rolls of film and have experiences that build upon each other, it's not for weeks after my return to New York City and my darkroom where I develop the film that I actually get to see the work that I've done. So with the digital camera, of course, we have a picture on the back of the camera or in the viewfinder of the camera or on a tethered computer to look at the moment after we've made that picture. And not having that for me, having a latent image on film that I don't get to see for weeks later, keeps my head in the experience.
And presumably, for The Way West, you were looking at work you hadn't had in front of you in quite some time, years probably.
I've always thought that that photography has sort of three different stages of editing. Editing in the world, where I make a decision to go someplace and to make pictures. And I'd like to think that that part of the process is as intuitive as possible, which is to say I'm reacting to a situation not because I'm looking for and finding pictures that I've preconceived, but because I'm sensitive to what's happening and I get excited and connected to an environment, a moment, the weather, the light, the scene unfolding in front of me. And I'm making pictures at a 500th of a second or a 125th of a second or something. And those things are cumulative, of course, and when I come home and I develop all the film, that's when the second stage of editing comes into play. And I would say that is without intuition for the most part. And that's really much more about recognizing patterns and looking for photographs that are exciting photographs, not because they're necessarily representative of the experience that I had, which is now in the past, but because they're good or interesting photographs. I think, the moment a photographer makes a picture, his or her responsibility is to the result, is to the picture. And, to a certain degree, at least in my case, I'd like that to represent an aspect of the reality that I experienced and hopefully an aspect of the reality of the experience of the subject that I'm photographing. So there's a sort of months-long process of printing images from the film that I've shot. And I cast my net pretty wide during that section of editing and end up with really hundreds of prints from a month or a month and a half long trip. And those get further boiled down in the third stage of editing, which is that part of editing which involves the consideration of who's the audience and what's the vehicle for sharing the pictures with the audience. Is it pictures going up on my website? Is an exhibition with 20 or 25 pictures that's going to last 4 weeks or 6 weeks and be seen by a limited number of people because of the geography of the exhibition space? Or, as is my preferred medium, a book which I think has the potential to certainly last a lot longer than I will. And that's the place that I have the kind of most rigorous and layered and in some ways difficult, but enjoyably difficult experience with editing.
Did your idea of the West evolve over the decade? I mean, it's such a mythologized place where we often have a false sense of the landscape, what it feels like, who the people are. I keep thinking of some stories I've heard you tell about sitting on a bar stool in some off-the-grid, hole-in-the-wall kind of bar, and the conversation changed everything. Did that happen enough, profoundly enough in a way, that changed your take?
I guess it happened profoundly, at least for me. I don't know if other people will share any recognition of the experience or the results being profound, but for sure there are different stages to one's realization and education about a place. And the first time that I go to a new place, I remember the first time that I went to Cuba, everything seemed photographable. Everything seemed like eye candy. It just looked new to me. It smelled new. There was different energy on the street. Everything was exciting, and I couldn't stop photographing. And I think it's like that, maybe a little less so with the trip to the West, because I've been on the road. I had been on the road for every year for 20 years before that, and there are certain things that happen that are predictable in terms of excitement of making photographs on the road. But for sure, after the first trip, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, there is a deepening sense of perception about what really happens beneath the surface. And that's informed, as you allude to, by things other than just the experience, the visual experience. And one of my favorite bar stool stories, it was somewhere in northern Montana, and it was a roadside tavern that at 2 or 3 o'clock on an August afternoon was particularly beckoning because it was so hot out. And I walked in, and it was dark, and there was one other person at the bar, and I sat myself at the opposite end, and he had a cowboy hat on. I don't know how old he was, but he was an older guy, probably in his 70s or 80s. And he was drinking a Budweiser, and I was drinking a Budweiser, and was silent. And he, out of the blue, sort of looked down, and he said, "Hey," he said, "you know what the difference between a real cowboy and a fake cowboy is?" And I said, No, sir, I don't." And he said, "Well, with a real cowboy, the only bullshit is on the outside of the boots." He said this after looking at my cowboy boots, and I laughed, and we had a great conversation about winter and about Montana and about the land, and I showed him my map, which had recorded a number of years of travel with lines that I draw on the map and notes that I take about places that I might want to return. And my experience with that man has been very similar to other experiences I've had where people are curious. They know I'm not from there. They don't necessarily know I'm from New York City, which creates a whole different layer of conversation and reaction. But it's a sort of a test. And I'd like to think that I passed that test as much as possible. And I think the main component to passing that test is having a sense of humor and having some respect for that which one doesn't know.
So do these kind of conversations make you feel that the West is somehow closer to its own roots than other parts of the country?
I'm not sure that that's the case. I think those kinds of experiences make me realize how similar we all are. One of the things, of course, that one realizes with photography is pattern in the work. And I've been really struck by the fact that a lot of the pictures that I took in Vermont, for instance, at particular state fairs or 4-H fairs, look like they could have been in Wyoming, look like they could have been in Louisiana. And I find that in some ways deeply reassuring about our common humanity.
I follow the stars, I carry my scars, I carry my scars. I know what I hear, I won't live in fear, I won't live in fear.
Peter Kayafas' The Way West was published by the Purple Martin Press. You can view images of his work at peterkayafas.com. Thank you for tuning in. Big thanks to our sound engineer, CJ DeGenero, and to the artists who contributed music. In order of appearance, they are Joseph Keckler for the adaptation of our theme music, Strangers from the Internet, Greensky Bluegrass for the song Handguns, Cooder for music from Paris, Texas, the original motion picture soundtrack, and Our Native Daughters for I Knew I Could Fly. In parting, let me just note that I still feel quite certain I wouldn't have survived on the Oregon Trail, but I do feel more in harmony looking at the West through these new lenses. Take it easy out there on your own trail, and we'll see you for more Shadow Yaddo in a couple of weeks.